Hello everyone. In first PU class, as per NCERT, there are 5 units in biology. Among the 5 units, the first unit is biodiversity in living world. Under this unit, there are 4 chapters. The first chapter is the living world. This chapter is for around 3 hours and the maximum weightage of the chapter is 3 marks. Before entering into the chapter, we need to recall many of the basic things like what is living organisms, what is non-living things. These things you have studied in your previous lower classes. And also you know about many of the unicellular organisms, multicellular organisms, prokaryotes, eukaryotes, and you also know about plants and many of the animals. Like this, these are the basic things that you need to recall to learn this chapter. The living world. Diversity in the living world. What do you mean by diversity? Diversity means variety and variability among the living organisms. We call it as diversity. Our planet Earth has various kinds of living organisms like prokaryotes, eukaryotes, unicellular organisms, multicellular organisms, plants, and many of the higher and lower animals, etc. Like this, Earth consists of all different kinds or different varieties of living organisms. Biodiversity can be defined as the variety and variability among the living organisms. The name itself is telling bio means living or life. Diversity means variety and variability among them, and that is why we can define the biodiversity as the variety and variability among living organisms. Still, in a very simple manner, we can also define biodiversity as sum of species richness. Sum means what? The complete total of all the different varieties of living organism which is present in the earth, and that we call it as biodiversity. What is living? The state of being alive is called as living. Living means any of the organism in its state, it should be alive. The state of being alive or in a living condition, we call it as living. A living organism exhibits some of the basic characteristics. It may be any living organism, either it may be prokaryotes or it may be eukaryotes, whether it is unicellular or multicellular, whatever may be, if it is a living organism, it shows some of the basic living characteristics. Which are those living characteristics? Such as growth, reproduction, metabolism, cellular organization, consciousness, etc. Like this, many of the different living characteristics that can be observed in an living organisms. We find living organism in all kinds of habitats such as aquatic, terrestrial or aerial habitat. First of all, we need to know what is a habitat. Habitat means a living organism where it lives, and that surrounding we consider or we call it as a habitat. If a plant is growing in a particular area, or if a plant is growing on the land, and that we call it as terrestrial habitat. If a plant is growing or if an animal is surviving in the water medium, and that we call it as aquatic habitat. So like that, habitat means an organism where it lives call it as habitat. Like this, an organism can be found everywhere in aquatic medium, terrestrial form, as well as in the aerial habitat. Now, we shall know one by one about the living characteristics in the living organism. Characteristics of living organism. Let us take the first characteristic, that is growth and development. What is growth then? Growth is a permanent and irreversible increase in size of an organism. Growth means it is a permanent process. It's permanent and irreversible. It cannot be reversed again. It's an irreversible increase in size of an organism, and that can be called as growth. Next, development is the sum of changes that occurs in an organ or in an organism during its lifetime, and that we call it as development. The changes may occur inside the body of the organism, that means within the organ or within the whole organism body, and that we call it as development. All living organisms grow, increase in their mass and also increase in number of individuals. That means each and every living organism shows growth and development, and it increases its mass. That means it increases its weight, and also it increases in number of individuals. Number of individuals is increasing. That means nothing but it is continuing its generation. It is increasing its population. That can be called as growth and development. And unicellular organisms or the multicellular organisms grow both by the cell division. Whether it is unicellular or multicellular, there is no difference. Whatever may be the cellular organization in living organisms, but they exhibit growth and development by the help of cell division. In plants, growth by cell division occurs continuously throughout their lifespan. Why we are specifying here throughout their lifespan? Because the same growth and development is seized at a particular period in animals. In animals, this growth is seen only up to a certain stage, and hence there is a difference between plants and animals' growth. In plants, the growth is a continuous process till its lifetime, but in animals, the growth is seized at a particular stage. In living organism, growth is internal. That means the development and growth is internal. The multiplication of the cells will be taking place. Development of the cells, organs, tissues, and the whole organ systems may also develop in the higher animals, but the growth is internal. But what about the external growth means? The non-living things like rocks, mountains also exhibit growth. How? By the deposition of materials on them, on the surface. This growth is called as external, but this is not the living type. These are the developments or the deposition of certain materials on rocks, mountains, and increases their mass and size, that we call it as external. Next, the second living characteristic, the most important living characteristic that can be seen in living organism, either it is unicellular, multicellular, or plants or animals, whatever may be, if it is an living organism, the very most important living characteristic that can be observed is reproduction. So what is reproduction? It is a biological process in which the organisms gives rise to offsprings or young ones similar to itself or similar to its own kind. That process we call it as reproduction. I would like to repeat, reproduction means it is a biological process in which an organism, a parental organism, gives rise to or it gives birth to young ones or offsprings similar to itself, and that process we call it as reproduction. Reproduction enables the continuity of the species generation after generation. I told you before itself, it's the most important living characteristic. Why? Because this is the one living character that is helpful for the continuation of the particular species of or a particular organism generation after generation. It increases its population, it continues its generation by the process and by the help of reproduction. Organisms reproduce both by asexual method as well as sexual type of method. This we know, and we also study in detail in further classes about asexual and sexual type of reproduction. What we can say, the organisms reproduces both by asexual method and sexual method. Asexual type of reproduction means the reproduction is taking place without the involvement of the sex organs or sex gonads. But here, sexual type of reproduction means reproduction will be taking place by the help of sex organs and by the fusion of gametes. That we call it as sexual type of reproduction. Examples for asexual type of reproduction: fungi. They reproduces by the formation of asexual spores. The spores will be dispersed and that spores will be developed into new individual. So they reproduces by the asexual spores. The second example, yeast and hydra. Both they reproduces by budding method. And the next third example is planaria, is one of the organism which comes under Platyhelminthes. Planaria, it reproduces by regeneration. How does it regenerate? The regeneration of the lost part of its body and becomes or develops into a new organism. If a planaria organism is there, if it is damaged or if the part of the planaria is fragmented or if it is cut into pieces, any single part or any fragment of planaria or any cut piece of the planaria has the ability to regenerate the lost part which is completely lost. That lost part can be regenerated by this organism and it develops into a whole body, becomes a new organism. So that can also be taken as an example for asexual type of reproduction. In certain fungi and also many of the filamentous algae and many of the protonymous mosses, they reproduces by fragmentation. It is also a type of asexual reproduction. What is fragmentation? A parental body is breakdown or it is cut into many pieces, and small single individual pieces or a fragment are capable of developing into a new individual, and that we call it as fragmentation. And this fragmentation can be seen in algae, mosses and also many of the fungi. Unicellular organisms like bacteria, amoeba and the other unicellular forms reproduce by the help of cell division. Whatever may be, either it is unicellular organisms or multicellular, or it may be any other unicellular organisms, the reproduction as well as the growth of the living organisms will take place by the help of cell division. There are many other organisms which do not reproduce at all. Which are those organisms? One example is mule. The second one is sterile worker honeybee, and then another example is infertile human couples. That means the couples who are not able to produce, or who are not able to conceive, or who are not capable of giving birth to a child, and that couples are called as infertile human couples. These are some of the examples that can be seen under reproduction. And the third, another living characteristic of the living organism is metabolism. Whatever the living organism, either unicellular or multicellular, higher level or lower level, plants, animals, whichever may be the living organism, each and every living organism exhibit or they show the chemical reactions in their body. All living organisms are made up of various chemicals. The sum of all the chemical reactions occur in organism body is called as metabolism. Sum means what? Total. All the total amount or the sum of chemical reactions that are taking place in an organism body, and that we call it as metabolism. Let me take the example so that we can easily understand what is metabolism. All plants, animals, fungi and microbes, all the organisms exhibit metabolism. Example, photosynthesis in plants. Photosynthesis is nothing but a food production takes place within the plant body by using many of the raw materials. How does that photosynthesis taking place? That is occurring, or that is taking place by the action of chemicals. Chemical reaction is taking place in the photosynthesis. So we can take photosynthesis as the metabolism. It's an example that can be taken in plants. Digestion in animals, etc. Digestion, even here the macromolecules are converted into micromolecules by the action of enzymes and by the action of many of the chemicals that are released in the human digestive tract, and that is how the digestion process is being completed, or the digestion process is taking place. Hence, even the digestion can also be considered as metabolism. We are telling the word sum. Sum of all the chemical reactions that are taking place in an organism body. Sum means what? If we take animal as an example, in animal, respiration is taking place, digestion is taking place, reproduction is taking place, circulation is taking place. Many of the activities are taking place in the human body or any of the living organism body. All those processes are nothing but the chemical reactions. So, the sum of means the total chemical reaction that is taking place in the organism body can be called as metabolism. Next, the fourth living characteristic that can be observed in living organism is cellular organization of the body. Cellular organization of the body is the defining feature of the life forms. Cellular organization, defining feature we are telling, means what? An organism can be made up of single cell, multi-cells. So, if there is multicellular, the cells will be grouped and that can be called as tissue. And many other higher living organisms are having different types of tissues and they are formed of organs. Still in higher organisms, either plants or animals, they are having the whole organ systems and which includes different organs. Like that, an organism may be of cellular level or tissue level or organ level or organ system level. Like this, the level of organization is differentiated. That is what we say. Cellular organization of the body is the defining feature of the life forms. In unicellular organisms, the single cell has the ability to perform all the life functions. That is why we consider the cells are the basic unit of structure and functional unit in living organism. A single cell is capable of doing all the living characteristics what we mentioned before, like growth, development, reproduction, metabolism, cellular organization, consciousness. Like this, all the living characteristics can be seen or can be performed by a single cell, and hence it is called as structural and functional unit in living organisms. In multicellular organisms, various levels of organization is present within them. As I mentioned before, in multicellular organisms, various levels means tissue level, organ system level. Like this, various levels of organization is present within the organism. Individual cells may perform specific functions and also it works together for the survival of the entire organism. A single cell may perform specific function. Only particular functions can also be performed by a single cell, and the single cell may include in the group, and it also works together for the survival of the entire living organism body. And this is how we can say in cellular organization of the body. Next, we shall see the fifth living characteristic, and this is the most important living characteristic that can be seen in living organism, that is consciousness, or in a simple way we can also say it as response. Consciousness is the ability to sense their surroundings or environment and respond to these environmental stimuli, which could be the physical, chemical or the biological stimuli. It's very clear, the definition. Consciousness is the ability to sense their surrounding. An organism is there, either it may be unicellular or multicellular or lower level of organisms or the higher level of organisms. An organism is there, and an organism has the ability to sense what is happening around the surrounding, and that ability itself we are calling it as consciousness. An organism have the ability to sense their surroundings or environment and respond. It responds to the environmental stimuli, which could be physical way, or which could be a physical response, or it may be a chemical response, also it may be a biological response. In any way it will respond to the stimuli, and that ability of an organism is called as consciousness. Plants respond to external factors. We are taking the examples now. The plants are responding to the external factors like light, water, temperature and other organisms. If other organisms disturbs, or if it does anything. Even for other organisms also the plants are responding, and many of the pollutants, etc. Like this, for different factors that are present in the surrounding of an organism, the organism is showing response to those stimuli, and that itself is the consciousness. All organisms from the prokaryotes to the most complex eukaryotes can sense and respond to environmental factors. Here the point is clear. Prokaryotes are the most complex eukaryotes. That means the simplest living cell or the highly developed living organism. Either it is unicellular or it is multicellular. An organism has the ability, can sense and respond. It can sense its surrounding or the environment, and it is creating respond to it for the external environmental factors. Example 1 here is photoperiod effects, reproduction in seasonal breeders, both the plant seasonal breeders or the animal seasonal breeders. Photoperiod effect. Photo is nothing but the light, the duration of light is affecting many of the plants or the animals during its reproduction time. That type of organisms which are depending on the photoperiod, we are calling it as seasonal breeders. That means some of the plants or some of the animals are active or they are capable to reproduce only during particular period of seasons, and such animals are called as seasonal breeders. Let me take some of the examples for seasonal breeders in plants like dahlia, lily, chrysanthemum. These are many of the flowering plants which reproduces, and more flowering will take places only during some particular seasons. And when we take animals for seasonal breeders, we can see goat, sheep, and majority of the frogs, and these are all reproduced at a particular period of time or a particular seasons, and such are the organisms. They are showing their reproduction in particular season. That means they are responding to the external environment. This is how the organisms are showing or they are responding to the external factors or the environment. Next we shall see about diversity in the living world. There are millions of plants and animal species are present in the world, and we know about them by their local names, and local names can also be called as vernacular names. These local names or languages, local languages would vary from place to place, even within a country or within a state. Here the lines are very clear. Diversity of organisms, different varieties, millions of plants, millions of animals, among the many of different species, different genus we are finding, different all organisms are called by different names. That is what we are calling it as local names. The local names of the organisms are also called as vernacular names. I would like to give you a very small, simplest example for local names that we use for the animals. Like we call a cat in English, it's an animal, we call it as cat. In Kannada, we call it as bekku. In the meantime, the same cat is called in Hindi as billy. Like this, the name of the organism is varying. but it is a same organism. What it leads to? It leads to confusion. When we take in fruits, mango, one of the simplest example that can be known by everyone. Mango is a fruit. It's an English term. When we call it in Kannada, mavu. In the meantime, we call it in Hindi as aam. Like this, the names are varying, but it is a same fruit. What it leads to? It leads to confusion. That is why these are termed as local names or the vernacular names. These words or these names are changing from place to place. Different word in Marathi, different word in Telugu, different name in Tamil, like this. As the language changes from place to place, the same organism will be called by different names. These local names or the many different languages would vary from place to place, even within a country or even within a state. Probably it would lead to confusion in identifying, because some will call by their own language and some other will call by in their mother tongue. Like this, as the language changes, it leads to confusion during the time of identification. Hence, there is a need to standardize the name of the living organism in such a way that a particular living organism is known to all by the same name all over the world, and that itself, which we call it as nomenclature. Such a beautiful process, the nomenclature. That means a single living organism is known by a particular name throughout the world, or the same, it is called by the same name by everyone, and that process of naming we call it as nomenclature. What we can define nomenclature as? Nomenclature is a process of naming of living organism. Naming of living organism, we call it as nomenclature.